Earlier this week, former Boston police officer Patrick Rose pled guilty to raping and sexually assaulting 6 kids over a period of nearly 3 decades and was sentenced to 10 to 13 years in prison. But it's far from case closed, as this has raised a lot of questions about just how far members of the BPD had gone to protect their own over the years. Despite a 1995 criminal complaint against Rose for sexual assault on a 12-year-old and an internal investigation and social services investigation that both determined there was enough evidence to support the accusation, Rose not only returned to duty, but served another 20 years, ultimately moving on to lead the Patrolmen's Union before retiring in 2018. Joined now by the former Suffolk County District Attorney who initiated the prosecution against Rose. She's now obviously the U.S. Attorney from Massachusetts, Rachael Rollins. U.S. Attorney, it's good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Always a pleasure.
You know, obviously every sane person is thrilled that Rose is going to jail. But I have to say, the notion that we may now never know who facilitated him staying on the force for 20 years, allowing him to become a serial predator, just gnaws at me. Does that not bother you?
Of course. This is a case, when it was first brought to my attention, that was incredibly troubling. There are 6 victims, as we know right now, and although he has a 10 to 13-year sentence, I believe he's parole eligible after 10. That is really devastating. That's less than 2 years per victim that this individual gets. And, you know, as the former DA, there are some times where we get sentences that we believe help us in the sense that this individual is no longer in the community and will not be harming anyone else. There's a long probationary period afterwards, but it's deeply disturbing to not have answers about how this happened. Now, I will say, Jim, this was over 30 years ago. There are lots of protocols and policies in place under Commissioner Long right now, where we are happy to say that we do not believe something like this could happen today.
But not all of it was 30 years ago. It began 30 years ago or 27 years ago.
It began 30 years ago, correct.
So Mayor Walsh refused to disclose any of the investigatory file. Kim Janey redacted virtually all of it. Should Mayor Wu release all of the file except that which is absolutely necessary to protect the identity of the survivors?
I think we do need to credit Mayor Janey for the fact that there was some transparency there. I leave it to Mayor Wu to make that decision. But Jim, what's important is we have to explain to the community and the public why it is that we don't turn information over. Sometimes there can be very good reasons why a public records request is denied or why we don't give the public access to information. But when we are silent and do nothing, it allows people to have other ideas about what we're doing. Are we involved in that conspiracy somehow? Are we trying to cover things up? And when I say we, I mean myself as a member of law enforcement. So these aren't easy answers, but I do think it's important that we do a post-mortem after we find circumstances where harm was done to make sure that there are policies and procedures in place where it can't happen again.
Quickly, did you read the file that was ultimately redacted and released when you were the DA?
Of course I did.
Do you think that 80% of it needed to be withheld from the public, as Kim Janey did?
I will not answer that question. I will leave that to Mayor Janey's counsel to make that determination. But for me, as the chief law enforcement officer of Suffolk County, where those 6 victims resided, yes, I read every single page unredacted, and I had a lot of questions as well.
Let's go from bad cop to bad cops. First consent decree with a community for police misconduct during the Biden administration was entered into by your bosses and you with the city of Springfield. Can you give us the gist of it here, if you would, U.S. Attorney?
Of course. So what happened was several years ago under my predecessor, U.S. Attorney Lelling, in the Trump administration, there was approval under Attorney General Sessions to open a pattern or practice investigation. And what that does, Jim, is it allows the federal government to start looking civilly into whether there are patterns or practices of unconstitutional or troubling behavior. Sadly, after a very thorough investigation, the Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, along with the office I am now privileged to lead, found patterns or practices of violations of Fourth Amendment rights of individuals in Springfield.
Excessive violence by the cops.
Excessive violence, strikes to the head, excessive force allegations that were sustained, some of them. And as a result of that investigation, and this is my predecessor in my civil division here, met with the mayor of Springfield as well as the commissioner of the police department, and came to a resolution whereby there is now a consent decree and there is going to be oversight regarding significant changes that have to happen at that department. I will say, Jim, that it's important to note there are close to 500 sworn officers in the Springfield Police Department. The narcotics unit, which is where the problems were found, is approximately 25 officers. So, a small
percentage. It's not an indictment of the whole force, is your point.
It's not an indictment of the whole force, but there were deep concerns with respect to that narcotics bureau, and there have been changes made already.
So let's move to a happier subject for a brief moment. You were installed, I think you were installed earlier, but the formal installation was last week. Virtually every luminary was there. What stuck out to me is virtually every living former U.S. attorney was there, including, at least by my count, 4 Republicans: Weld, Sullivan, Budd, and Lelling, a couple of whom are very conservative people. Did it occur to you at any moment that 4 of your Republican predecessors honored you with your appointment, yet not one of their fellow Republicans in the Senate thought you were fit to serve as U.S. Attorney?
I definitely was aware of the first part of that sentence. It was an honor and a privilege to have a formal investiture. And I know you're teasing me. It's like my 9-year-old who wants to have 15 birthdays. I promise you, I had to be sworn in before I took office.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the last one. But it was humbling to look and see Governor Weld sitting there, who supported me and was vocal about my qualifications to be U.S. Attorney, as well as my predecessor, U.S. Attorney Lelling, U.S. Attorney Nate Mendel, as well as obviously U.S. Attorney Budd and others, U.S. Attorney Ortiz. So we had close to 10 living United States attorneys in that room, and that's history. And I am deeply honored to call them my colleagues, and I have very big shoes to fill with respect to each of them.
Well, if at any point you do want to talk again about the Republicans in the Senate, you give me a call, and we'll be happy to do that. I'm not sure if it was at that investiture or at a different time. You announced this new unit around equity issues. Specifically, what I'm most concerned about is around human trafficking. What will that unit do that was not done by the U.S. Attorney's Office in Massachusetts before?
This office has always cared deeply about human trafficking, but there hasn't been a designated unit focused exclusively on human trafficking. We have, for example, the head of the gang unit also is the liaison with respect to human trafficking. I want somebody who is going to focus, or individuals that are primarily focused on human trafficking, and that's what we're trying to do. Jim, we've seen a huge uptick in this type of criminal behavior, in particular in vulnerable communities. Like, for example, at the Mass Ave and Melnia Cass intersection, where we see mental health and substance use disorder coming together to a head, we also see, sadly, drug trafficking and human trafficking happening at exorbitant rates in those specific areas. And many of the individuals that human traffic and traffic in drugs also have illegal firearms. So there's a lot of intersectionality, and we want to make sure we get experts that are working and available to the Boston Police, the Mass State Police, as well as all of our law enforcement partners across the Commonwealth.
That's terrific. You know, if we can move to another local issue, the Supreme Court upheld, reinstated, I don't know what the appropriate verb is, the death penalty for Jahar Tsarnaev. And I hope you can reconcile something for me. Joe Biden campaigned for president against the death penalty, yet his Justice Department argued before the Supreme Court of the United States for the reinstatement of the death penalty against Tsarnaev. This is not about whether he deserves the death penalty or not. At least my question is not. Can you reconcile those two things for us, U.S. Attorney?
I can. I believe that there is a moratorium on executions under this administration right now. I would phrase what you are saying differently. I think what the Department of Justice argued was that the jury got it right, that the jury was presented with evidence under a previous administration and they got it right. And that's what we were arguing for. Whether you or I agree with the death penalty or not, isn't relevant to this analysis. We believe Judge O'Toole and that those jurors who worked incredibly hard over weeks and weeks and weeks, if not months of trial, and then later the death phase of that process, we believe they got it right.
But under Joe Biden, Tsarnaev would never be put to death, or at least unless that moratorium is removed. Is that not correct?
That is in fact correct. And those two things can coexist. For example, Gary Lee Sampson, which is another death penalty case that we had, that was brought under then DA Sullivan and soon to be U.S. Attorney Sullivan, because one of the victims died in Michael Sullivan's jurisdiction in Plymouth County. And then he brought the case federal under the carjacking statute for those 3 victims that Gary Lee Sampson murdered. We argued after Gary Lee Sampson died to against the abatement doctrine, which would have permitted Mr. Sampson to die without the convictions regarding the 3 people he murdered and not sentenced to death.
Because there were still appeals pending. Was that not the notion behind the abatement?
So, and it's very interesting, Jim. It's not consistent where I fully understand that pre-verdict, if you die, you are innocent until proven guilty. But Gary Lee Sampson has been, not only did he plead to those 3 murders, but or 2 of them in Massachusetts, he was found responsible and put to death by a jury. So what we have is, thankfully those 3 families will never have to deal with Mr. Sampson again, but he died a serial killer who was sentenced to death.
One last thing, Rachael Rollins, one of, I think, the legacies that you deserve a lot of credit for is the creation of this Integrity Review Bureau when you were the DA, which I'm sure viewers, we've had a lot of the men who were freed after decades in prison for crimes they did not commit, thanks to the work of that Integrity Review Bureau. Near the end of your tenure, Stephen Pena was also looked at by that bureau, 28 years in prison, ultimately released by a judge when it turned out that prosecutors had withheld evidence pointing to another killer, buried compromising evidence around key witnesses. The judge himself said, quote, there was a fairly high likelihood that a new trial would be granted by him. I asked your successor, Kevin Hayden, if he would join the defense in the motion for seeking a new trial for Mr. Pena, and here's a little piece of what he had to say.
We'll support whatever the judge finds in this matter. Any impropriety or improper conduct by either the police or the district attorney's office that took place in this case simply can't stand.
So he'll leave it to the judge. He will not join in the motion for a new trial. Are you disappointed by that? Would you have in the past and other similar cases? Were you disappointed by that?
I'm not disappointed by anything that's happening in the Suffolk County DA's office. No matter who's leading an office, they have the ability to make their own decisions. And
would you have made the same decision?
So I would have looked at the evidence, and I did make a decision about Mr. Pena.
Would you have joined in the motion for a new trial?
Well, I believe, Jim, that we did file something with respect to Mr. Pena saying that we supported and were concerned about some of the unconstitutional behaviors that we saw. I will say to you further, I had the privilege of meeting Thomas Coons today, actually, who was just released, the Marine that had been offered a very small sentence if he pled. And although that did not happen inside of Suffolk County, I wrote a letter as DA. Listen, you can firmly support law enforcement and be the chief law enforcement officer while also condemning unconstitutional behavior. And that's something that I did and was proud to do. And every time I did it, I made sure that I called Commissioner Gross or Commissioner Long, as well as the family members of the individual that lost their lives. Oftentimes, these are murder cases where there are victims or survivors that are left, not just the defendants that believe they were wrongfully convicted, but the family members of the murder victims that are left feeling as if they've been lied to because they were told somebody was responsible for that murder. So these are complicated issues. I'm never going to second guess or question what DA Hayden is doing. I just will tell you that I spent an inordinate amount of time myself reviewing these matters. And when I saw behavior that I was not proud of, that I would not put my name on, I had no problem assenting to motions with defendants or opposing them if I thought it was appropriate. And I'm hopeful that DA Hayden will do the same.
Rachael Rollins, good to see you. Thanks for your time.
Always a pleasure.